Well, good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Nesta Talks To, our online seminar series. My name is Vicky Selleck. I'm Nesta's Executive Director of Programmes, and I'm delighted to join you today as our host for this international convening of great thinkers. Most of you will know Nesta already, but for those of you who don't, we're a global innovation foundation that bring bold ideas to life to change the world for good. And this series, Nesta Talks To, is an informal conversation series with interesting thinkers focused on the big topics that will define our future. In an age of overabundance of information, it's really hard to know how we make sense of the choices we face as a society, and indeed how we as citizens might shape our own future. So to guide us towards some possibilities, perhaps even some answers, certainly some more questions, we're speaking to a range of thinkers, from artists, social entrepreneurs, community builders, and academics, to understand the world around us and think about how we participate in shaping what is to come. Each month we focus on a different conversation. I'm delighted to be joined this month by Professor Richard Sennett and Dr. Pablo Sendra, who are both going to talk to us about the future of cities and what they might look at. 50 years ago, Richard wrote The Uses of Disorder, a real sort of game-changing piece at the time. Indeed, I can remember reading it as part of my undergrad degree in geography. But it argued that actually, as we got more intentional about how we designed and constructed cities, that actually that could lead to significant flaws. It could lead to oversimplification, to restrictive environments that look and feel the same and don't allow community to thrive. I'm sure you'll recognise some of that description. The issues feel as important today as they did 50 years ago, particularly when we think about how planning laws have changed, how cities around the world are starting to look homogenous in their city centres, and how we think about police surveillance and privatisation of some of our green and public spaces. They perhaps feel somewhat different and they lead us with questions. So what can be done? Can disorder, disruption, creativity ever be designed in at the beginning? How can citizens help to shape and mould the cities that they live in so that they can flourish? Well, Dr. Pablo Sendra has joined Richard in exploring that text and thinking about it from a 21st century perspective. He's a planner by background, so he brought a new feel and look and flavour to some of the issues raised 50 years ago. We're going to be speaking to both of them this lunchtime, and perhaps Richard, we'll start with you. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about your core premise here?
Hello, well, I'm glad to talk to you. I don't know if this is a cool premise or not, but it's one that's shaped me for a lot of my life. I should say about this book that I wrote 50 years ago, that I wrote it because I thought that in a way cities were being planned, that they were paralyzing people's experience. They segregated people into class as well as racial ghettos, but more than that, there was a way in which planning at that time parceled out where you should do what in a way that was very I thought destructive to the experience of innovation and experiment and serendipity. And it had become richer kinds of human beings that we needed a more complex and uncontrolled environment. Well, that was then. I still had hair then. You know, it was a different life. Sometime after I wrote the book, I became very enchanted with pure academic life. And I began to work for the United Nations as a consultant. which I've done for the last 35 years. And it was amazing to me to see how many of the ideas that I'd had about New York, Chicago, London, very rich, relatively rich places, played out in the developing cities that I was now engaged in as a planner. And I'm going to show you a picture of what the uses of disorder looks like in Delhi. This is a place called Nehru Place. It should be sacred to all of you because this is the Silicon Valley of Delhi. It's a place where electronics on the ground are sold to the public, and where in this disused government building on the side, there are all sorts of electronic startups. What makes it a place that, to me, is alive is that it's a mixture of Muslims and Hindus working in this kind of shadow world of electronic and computer startups, mixed in with very, as you can see in the slide, very traditional pursuits, people selling saris, they sell chapatis and so on. It attracted my attention originally because this is the least violent spot in Delhi. It's a spot which is, as you know, India has a very severe problem of ethnic violence. And here, that problem with these people mixed together is less than it is in the rest of the city. And the reason for that has to do with uses of disorder, that this is a space in which people have to, there's nothing defined about it really, in which people have to deal with each other, have to think of each other in more complex ways than just an enemy in order to survive. It also has elements, although it looks unplanned, in which that kind of disordering, that kind of dealing with complexity, that kind of openness is actually something brought into being by physical design. What you're seeing here on the ground is actually the roof of an underground garage, which has been colonized by people who are selling these electronics to the public. Most of the electronics have, by the way, fallen off a truck. This is a space of the informal economy, which is uncontrolled. The edges of this site, very importantly, are open and amorphous. It's a space that's extremely porous rather than well-defined. From Nehru Place to its surroundings is something that doesn't have rigid kind of definitions in it. The traffic patterns in it are also very overlaid, complex, and contradictory. There are bike lanes in the garage, for instance. People frequently have to keep their eyes very sharply alert to being hit by cars or vice versa. And the pedestrian traffic on the top is very mixed. So this is a kind of space that as I began working as a practical planner, it seemed to me, although the Indians want to tear it down and of course build high-rise housing, that this is a valuable space. This is a space where disorder has created a kind of attentiveness and openness and complexity of experience, which results in such practical things as people being able to live with each other. And when I heard from Pablo, Sendra, that he was interested in this book of mine, which went out of print for decades, I have to say, my ego was flattered. But it also seemed to me that maybe we were on the verge of together of finding a way that we could do the analog of making a Nehru place, of making a space which invited complexity, multiplicity, and even contradiction, so that people had that kind of energized use. I should say finally about this, that there is a theory behind the uses of disorder, but I didn't know it then. It's a theory of open systems and of system complexity, which was very much out of fashion 50 years ago, and now has come into its own as a way of alternatives, for instance, the kind of modeling you've seen in the COVID pandemic, which is a very closed system way of modeling. And for me now, today, I sort of realize what I couldn't have known then, which is that the theoretical underpinnings for design disorder are to be found in open systems theory. And so with that, since Pablo's actually done the work of making a tool for this, I will give over to him. And I guess I'll mute, is that correct? Yes? Okay.
Super, thank you, Richard. Pablo, over to you then. Tell us a little bit more about what inspired you about these concepts and how you've thought about them in connection to a 21st century city.
Well, hello, thank you, Nesta, for inviting us to this event, and thanks everyone for attending. I'm going to speak about those motivations that I had for writing this book, and then also go very quickly through some of the strategies that we propose in the book, and then in the Q&A we can do a bit more details on that. So I first read The Uses of Disorder when I was 25, which is the same age as Richard when he wrote the book. And it was 2009 at that time, when the crisis of capitalism and the economic recession were bringing a period of uncertainty, and also an opportunity for social movements like the 15M in Spain that happened later in 2011, or the Occupy movement here in the UK and in the US. So I was at that time an urban design master's student at the Bartlett at UCL. And I saw many connections between what Richard described in his book and the present situation, both in terms of social movements and also in terms of urban planning. Because I saw that 50 years after the book was published, but it was 40 at that time, regeneration schemes still seek to remove unwanted behavior and tend to domesticate informality. So because the arguments of the book were valid 50 years later, I made myself the question, can architects and planners design disorder? But what do we mean by disorder? That's a question that's been asked many times and still being asked about today. And I think we try to make it very clear in the book that we don't mean disorder as disorder architectural forms like in postmodernism. We mean a contestation of imposed orders. And those imposed orders were different in the 1960s than what they are today. And I think at the beginning of my part in the book, I put the example of the Westway in North Kensington that I think illustrates very well these two kinds of imposed order. So the Westway is a motorway that crosses North Kensington in London. And it was built in the 1960s, and it was one of these strategies of building kind of like basically a line that crosses through the middle of the neighborhood and erases whatever it's in its way. And that was the kind of orders that we could see in the 1960s. But also it was interesting the kind of contestation that happened from the community that came together and claimed the land below the motorway for community use. First by starting occupying it using it as playground, and then by forming more like a community land trust for the land. And then the current situation, what the community is opposing or contesting is that the trust that manages that land has taken kind of like a real estate or took kind of like in 2015, kind of like a real estate approach, a commercial real estate approach, and it's gentrifying the area. So different kind of like grassroots initiatives came together to hold the trust into account. And then after the Grenfell fire happened in the same area, those same grassroots movements occupied one of the spaces below the motorway and turned it into a community space for storing donations and healing for the victims and so on. So I think these two situations, the construction of motorways or gentrification and real estate urbanism, they illustrate well the kinds of orders that we're looking at, and that in a way we aim to contest through these strategies presented in this book. So I started looking how to put this into drawings and also words through experimenting with urban design interventions, how we could create the kinds of disorder that Richard discussed in his book, which are kind of like unregulated public space, or the narrow place picture that Richard just showed, which are unregulated public spaces where people learn how to tolerate difference, which encourage social interactions and the emergence of unplanned activities. But I soon faced a contradiction, which is, I mean, how can we design disorder if design is actually an act of ordering by itself? So my response to that contradiction was through the returning from the infrastructure, which in a way create conditions and provide possibilities. And that's why the title of the strategies that we propose are infrastructures for disorder, which are initial interventions that create conditions for the unplanned use of the public realm, and which are points of departure for a continuous and open process. So we divided this infrastructure for disorder in 4 chapters, which are the ones in my part that are below, above, disorder in section, and process and flux. So I'm going to share slides now to show the drawings. I'm going to speak very briefly about this. You can see my screen now. So I'm going to speak very briefly, and then we can go in depth in the questions. So these are the strategies that are illustrated through 4 chapters, but also through a series of drawings. And the first set of strategies. The images there. Can you see the images in the screen? Yeah. Okay. Good. The 4 set of strategies. The first of the strategies is below, and is in a way the first of the strategies to turn a closed system into an open system, and this is done through reassembling the infrastructure, rearranging the elements to make them more visible, so making the infrastructure more visible, more accessible, more open. Making the structure collectively managed, so it provokes collective awareness, negotiations, cooperations, relations of solidarity, social interaction. And this is done normally through introducing certain disruptions in the infrastructure that generate that collective awareness. And also making infrastructure that has the capacity to grow. Then the next set of strategies is called above, and they explore what happens above the surface. So once the infrastructure is provided, what kind of relationships and interactions emerge from that infrastructure. So in a way, the strategies in the surface, what they propose is creating a flexible public space that can be continuously modified and changed, where there are different areas of the surface, of the urban surface, that provides different types of infrastructure, different also maybe foundations for adding new structures and construction, and where each part provide different possibilities for different things and activities and to happen, different qualities of the public space. Sorry, I'm going very quickly through that, but I want to allow more time to the questions. But we can discuss this in detail. Then the third sub-strategies are the disorder in section, which they aim to turn the closed system that Richard talks about into an open system. And the first step to turning in the section, the first step to turning a closed system into an open system is through the longitudinal section, through the section that crosses kind of like a street. Where we can work on eliminating divisions, creating a hierarchy of experiences from going from one place to another. And this hierarchy of experiences is created through introducing certain disruptions in the street that in a way break these boundaries, these boundaries that also Richard talks about in his text about the open city. And then after that, we can look into detail on how to introduce these disruptions in the section through the cross section, which is essentially through assembling different elements in the section. So working as we did with the strategies below and the strategies above, working in connection with the strategies below and above to plug in different elements that create different urban experiences and that break these barriers and introduce these disruptions in the public space. And this is done through light structures, also through building construction that then can leave a space for growing and for continuous kind of like going up and adding more activities. And finally, the last set of strategies is the one called process and flux. There's no illustration for that one. There's no illustration for that one because that's more about the process on how to build these infrastructures for disorder. And the book proposes two kind of processes that in a way have also been said through in the other chapters. One is introducing disruptions that provoke negotiations. And this is kind of like the beginning. If there's no social interaction, which kind of interventions and disruptions we can put in the public space to start provoking those negotiations. And for that, it's important to look at which are the existing processes, the existing social relationships, the history of the place, and then provoking negotiations, working with what is already there. And then finally, the second part is designing with uncertainty, which is understanding these strategies as strategies that can bring unpredictable outputs. So we're not sure about how they will work, what will happen, but that's something to a certain extent positive. So as architects, as planning, being okay with the fact that what we do is going to be unpredictable and seen as a positive thing. And then understanding the interventions as an open system that can continuously change and adapt, and that are never reach a stable state like a closed system, but are continuously changing. So I'm going to leave it here now for the questions. And yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Pablo, and beautiful to see your illustrations to help bring some of this to life. Some of the examples that you use in the book, just to kind of put some language on it, things like actually how you pave a communal area that might give people a sense that market traders could have pop-up stalls here, or kids could play games over here, or actually you deliberately plant big trees under which people will seek shade and have community interactions, or you put power or water or electricity into certain points and then let people decide how to use those as a community and what will swell up. And I think that understanding that these physical pieces of infrastructure can be put in order then to leave open possibilities for what the land and the space is used for, I think is a really powerful one. You touched there, Pablo, just at the end on negotiations. You were saying some of this infrastructure should be put in and deliberately almost not planned for, so that actually community members have to talk to one another. Let's say you put in a drinking water station. Well, actually, who has access to that? Is there priority access for different people? Who's paying the water bill? How is that valued and shared amongst community organisations in the place or amongst private traders in the place? I think that's a really interesting concept. Very often, when we talk about policy-led interventions, we're sort of trying to design solutions for people from the beginning. Say a little bit more about why you think some of this should be open to help and to allow for conflict and negotiation as part of it. And I should say, just before you start talking to all of our audience members, I would love to ask your questions as well. So please see the Q&A box right down the bottom, start typing your questions in there. You can upvote ones that you like by clicking on the thumbs up button, and that way we'll ask the most popular ones first. But Pablo, first of all, say a little bit more about some of these things you can design in order to create both community infrastructure but not planned for, so that people are allowed to negotiate locally what it's used for.
So, I mean, that's kind of like one of the first step. I mean, when we looked at this book, so we were particularly interested in those spaces where social interaction does not happen a lot. So this is not a book for spaces where there's already kind of like informality and there's kind of like a strong social infrastructure already happening, but it's mainly for those spaces where it's not happening and how to create it. That's why one of the first steps to generate, to a certain extent, this social infrastructure, these relationships of solidarity, cooperation, is through provoking them through a shared infrastructure. Because to a certain extent, when we ourselves, we have, let's say, our own energy bill, our own water bill, and so on. We're just not that aware of the infrastructure. When we, at a certain extent, we just pay the bill. Maybe if we've paid too much in 1 month, we see what's happened and so on, but we don't pay too much attention to the infrastructure. The infrastructure is kind of like in a black box, and we just pay for its use, and that's it. Whereas if a community is sharing a piece of infrastructure, say for example, a community decides to install solar panels on top of their housing estate, and suddenly they have to start negotiating on what's going to happen with this energy. They're going to use it for the public space, they're going to use it for the domestic use, and then once they use all the energy, what happens if there's an excess of energy? What do? They sell it? What do they do with that money? How they invest it? So there starts to being a series of negotiations where people are much more conscious about the infrastructure, the resources that they're sharing. So the infrastructure becomes from something very passive that we just pay for its use as kind of like another something that has kind of like more agency and that generates a certain interaction.
If I could just add one thing to this.
Yeah, sure.
I would say in your question, there's something that is to me very disturbing, which is it's a horrible error that planners make, which is best practices ideal. That is, that there's a right way to do something. That's I found in the planning work I've done, that's very paralyzing to people. Follow the science, etc. In planning, that we have that paralysis when there's a problem, we present a solution. What Pablo and I are trying to do here is say that for a given problem, there are lots of different kinds of solutions. And rather than to choose for people, they have to choose themselves. I also think that's true in the pandemic, but I know that's not your story today. But you understand what that is. In planning schools, when we teach best practices, we're teaching a form of oppression.
It's a powerful statement, Richard, and one I'm sure lots of people in our audience will engage with, partly because many of them will be planners themselves, but partly because people feel that construct and oppression from the physical space they're within that they don't feel reflects them necessarily or speaks to their particular needs. One of the questions we've got asked here from Stella is about actually how multicultural spaces in cities genuinely reflect their local populations. We live now in very internationally flavoured cities. Actually, lots of people may have heritage which is not of, a kind of London planning school past, but actually want to see joy in other types of spaces, want to use community space for other things, actually want to visually see, the example Stella gives is, round things rather than all rectangular buildings. What do you think that means for the 21st century city? Should it be reflective of the communities that abide within it?
Should we both answer? Go ahead, Pablo.
Well, I think that in the chapter Process and Flux, one of the things that I think we make a lot of emphasis on is looking at which are the processes, social relationships already existing, particularly in such a multicultural city like London. I mean, one needs to pay particular attention of the kind of attachment that people have to their buildings and places, and the way people gather, the cultural practices that happen in each different place, and work from there. And those kind of like the kind of interventions that we propose here should be done after this is understood, particularly because one of the approach that planners have taken in cities like London and is exactly what Richard was saying, applying kind of like a standard of best practice of what is supposed to be placemaking, and then without looking carefully at what is already there. And that has led to the closure of community centers, library, social spaces that have a lot of impact and that people value a lot. So I think that's also something very important to take into account those processes and look carefully into each different place.
You know, I think the thing about mixed spaces is that it's as in chemistry, you can have a mixture or you can have a chemical reaction. And the problem is making mixture work. And the only way you can make mixture work is by devolving power to the people who are in that space. So that if you do what is a tendency in British planning, which is to count heads, you know, and say this is a very mixed area because there are lots of different kinds of people in it, it's a meaningless calculation, you know. And that's why the end of Pablo's and my book is really about how do you inaugurate that kind of chemical reaction between people. And you have to do that by, in the most elemental way, a kind of sink or swim mentality about what's going to happen. Either you do it, or you know, the environment it's nothing will happen. I found that very much the case when I worked in the Lebanon after the Civil War. Which I didn't do as much work there as I meant to do, but even so, that when you said to people about, say, restoring electricity to a neighborhood, if you leave it all to us, if you leave it all to these outside authorities, nothing's going to happen because you're still not going to be able to deal with the fact that you've got to survive together or you're not going to survive at all. And that was one of the techniques we used, rather than saying, we'll do it for you, we'll provide the electricity, which helped to bring some measure, temporary measure of relief to the Lebanon. It's a very, very fundamental principle, I think, in planning, that counting heads and mixing heads, just mixity, is not what we mean by complexity. It's a raw material for it, but it's inert. Same thing is true, if I can just say this, I'm struck about this by British schools, which count heads, but don't provide many means for kids to actually, in the classroom, make that mixity work, you know. So I think that's why the last chapter of our book is as it is.
Thank you. Alex is asking us a question, Pablo, sticking on this sort of theme of children. Actually, one of the things that happened with the Westway motorway over part of West London and communities taking over that space is lots of playgrounds opened up, lots of youth spaces, as well as areas for children. It's right under a motorway. It's not exactly where you would intentionally say is the healthiest space for children. How do you get the balance right in planning terms of leaving people open to use spaces as they wish, but also really designing health from the beginning. Yeah, think on that. So what would you say there, Pablo?
Yeah, well, I think that the Westway has kind of like a very particular history in terms of I mean, occupying I mean, I think it's more kind of like the act of occupying a space below the Westway as a compensation for the I mean, for the damage done for the community and building different kind of community infrastructure. But yeah, I mean, there's an obvious issue with air pollution that comes from these kind of like urban motorways, and a way out need to be found from kind of like these kind of urban motorways that were built in the 60s. Well, and there's still some of them built today, and so cities have taken kind of like different approaches to change them. But yeah, I mean, I think traffic is something. I mean, that kind of traffic going through an urban area is something that definitely need to be changed to a certain extent.
And switching tacks for a moment. So, Richard, a question from me. I wondered to what extent 50 years ago you predicted how much of our public realm would be privately owned by now. It's certainly been a surprise to me in the last 10 or 15 years how many spaces, little green pockets or little bits of urban infrastructure turn out to be privately owned, and therefore have surveillance cameras and special rules and all sorts of things going on. So firstly, how much did you predict? And then secondly, a question from Steve, who's asking, given there's complex financial, local political interests invested in every place, how do you get the kind of regeneration that genuinely domesticates informality rather than limiting and controlling what is done there? So, Richard.
Very huge question. Well, about my crystal ball has always been cloudy, I have to say. So, but it was evident to all of us 50 years ago that parking on street parking was a privatization of public space. It's something we often forget. My colleague Jan Gehl, a Danish planner, has done very precise calculations. It's 38, 41 in New York City's 45% of all public space is privatized by parking vehicles. And so one of the logics of pedestrianization is taking back the public for the public space for the public. You've got a terrible problem in Britain and in London in particular, because you're privatizing your river. That the buildings that you're putting there make it harder and harder for people to use, not walk along, which is okay, but actually dwell in spaces by the river. It's one of the reasons that Sadiq Khan is moving out of the Norman Foster building, often known among planners as the Testicle, to East London, because the space around Foster's building is dead, and much of that building space there has been privatized. But this was long evident, and so I mean, it's one of the strategies about pedestrianization. How can you do it strategically to republic size, if I can say that, to take back for the public what belongs to the public? It's very expensive to put automobiles underground, which is what happened in Nehru Place. And it's the answer is not to hide the cars away, but to get rid of them, you know. So that's that part of this. I really couldn't say for Britain how you could do, as a foreigner observing what's going on here. I would say that most public-private partnerships that I know about here don't deliver value for money. And that's just a gross observation. Maybe there are some that work. But I'm just struck by, as again, with this COVID thing, that when you ask the private sector to do something, you get poorer quality, you get more profit, but you get poorer results. And I think that's a nettle you've got to grasp. There are public-private partnerships that work well. We made some very good ones in the Middle East, in unlikely places. But here, they seem to be just a kind of distribution of public goods to the profit sector. And I would, as I say this as an observer, it fucks up so often that you've got to figure out why systematically you don't get value for money by public-private partnerships. There has to be a reason. It's not just a one-off.
Yeah, I think lots of people will recognise that description and its frustration and the promises that public-private partnership could bring, but so much perhaps lost potential along the way. Thinking about the sort of,
but maybe it's the wrong thing to do.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not a lost potential. Maybe there is no potential there.
You
know,
you mentioned COVID and what's been possible during the pandemic, and I'm certainly struck by the images of Manchester and Liverpool and Bristol and places which have really taken over their streets and re-pedestrianised, thought about safe cycling routes, you know, painted beautiful murals on the ground, create spaces that are shared between local traffic, children cycling and playing, etc. And it's been great to see how quickly that work has been accelerated because of the pandemic and the need to take people out of kind of public transport infrastructure where they might have much more risk of transmission. But what else do you think the pandemic could bring for us in terms of, is there an opportunity here to accelerate some of the thoughts, the concepts that you're talking about, this more open, democratic, for the people cities, or do you think it will only lead us in the opposite direction towards more constraints and barriers and privatisation?
Well, I think it'll lead towards more centralization, certainly. You haven't used, you've got, for instance, with test and trace, you have a huge infrastructure of very skilled testers and tracers in community health organizations, but they're local. And if you are, as we know about conservative parties since the time of Thatcher, it's to deny people local control, but to deny people resources, but to centralize. They're centralizers. And you've seen that with this COVID, that they've hired centrally a whole test and trace operation, which has failed significantly, but they haven't called on a resource they had, which was this local people who know the areas where they're at, who are not dependent on epidemiological forecasting and so on. So, I mean, I think it's a systematic problem. And it's a problem where dealing with, you would think that you need a national strategy to deal with a pandemic like this, which knows no boundaries in a way. That's not true. You need to have local knowledge in order to deal with who's sick, who should be isolated, and who will take care of them. That's not an epidemiological question. That's a question about knowledge. And it will vary from place to place, and the answers to what to do about that will vary from place to place. You can't have a coherent strategy. The moment you start talking that, you're talking about removing people from actually knowing what's happening. So that's sort of, you know, I'm very old, so, you know, I'm quite worried about this. I don't want to be part of an epidemiological model. I want to know that if my wife and I felt sick, that somebody would actually know about it, who lives where we live. And that's not the route we're pursuing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we've seen some really wonderful examples of communities genuinely caring for one another, mutual aid groups setting up. But many of the local authorities that we have in our learning set at Nesta, the Upstream Collaborative, would recognise that description of a centralised system which assumes the answers are in the data, rather than devolving power to those closest to the ground, to the local authorities and community organisations that are there to deal with it.
Yeah.
Simon's asking a question that
Sorry.
I don't think I'll be able to articulate as well, so I'm actually going to read it. So Simon says, Pablo, you can perhaps answer this one. With ambiguous spaces, how do you keep the space changing and not just ending up set on a fixed majority view of how it should be used? But how do you stimulate that disruption, or to stop a place from staying so stable? You need provocations as you go along. What's your experience of that, Pablo?
Yeah, sorry, just to answer the previous, just to add something to the previous question, that I think one of the things that COVID has shown as well is the importance of having a strong social infrastructure, which is related also with what Richard was saying. Having, having communities that are already sharing those resources, that know each other, and then can support each other in these kind of situations. And that, in a way, is kind of like different from the individualistic neighborhoods that we live in. So to a certain extent, the kind of sharing infrastructures and interventions that we talk about in this book, I think goes towards creating that social infrastructure that would make communities much more resilient to this kind of pandemics. And then regarding that, these other questions of keeping the place changing, I think it's important to understand that for us as architects and planners, that when we do a project, it's not the end of. So, for example, if we design a public space, we do not deliver a finished product. So we deliver kind of like the beginning of a process to a certain extent. And I think that's something very important that urban designers need to have in mind. So to a certain extent, we deliver a series of first interventions that would that would motivate these initial activities and so on. But it's important to plan to plan a space that could grow organically, or if it needs kind of like further interventions and further management, plan for that. And there is an example in the book that I think helps, is very helpful in that sense, which is the design of Gillette Square in Dalston. In Gillette Square, the design, which initially was just providing a few kiosks with affordable rent for local people, which was mainly Afro-Caribbean businesses. It was kind of like one, there was kind of like a small radio station. I mean, there was kind of like very small businesses using the kiosk, and that kind of like triggered people using this space that used to be a car park. Then those people using this space motivated changing the surface from a car park to a square. And then there were further interventions that added containers with things like projectors, sport equipment, child play equipment, and different things that will be able to change the space continuously. So in a way, every intervention, they're actually from different architects. There were two different practices involved in different moments. Acknowledge that the intervention was part of a longer process of a space that is continuously changing. And I think that's what we need to aim to produce in terms of design, something that is not finished.
Richard, a question here from Jonathan. How do we negotiate the fact that the users of the space are rarely also the owners of the space? Can you incentivize private developers, landlords, often people who are risk averse, to give agency to users?
Well, it goes back to the previous question about how do you give public space back to the public. And this is a very good question that Jonathan asks, I found very idiosyncratic, and of course, my career as a planner, idiosyncratic answers to that depending on the developer. And some developers who are in it for the long term will try and loosen up spaces so that they can evolve, because they know for the long term, a fixed investment in a fixed kind of space is not very viable. That was true, for instance, of the Rockefellers when they owned Rockefeller Center. It's very fixed, but its uses changed constantly. When you have short-term investors, you're dealing with a completely different situation. They put their money in, they're going to turn what's called turnkey investments, where they're going to take their money out as quickly as they can, leave it to somebody else who will own the private space. And they tend to be very rigidly minded. They just want to do it. They want to package it, sell it, and get out, take their profits. So one of the things that we've pursued as a planning strategy is that if you're going to get access to an important piece of land or to an important source of money from the UN or the World Bank or so on, you have to be in there for the long haul because they're curiously going to be more flexible to it. And that's dealt out quite a few property developers who say, I'm not interested in owning something. I'm interested in managing a piece of property and going through it. So, but there is a strategy for dealing with this question. It's very idiosyncratic. As I say, it depends on whether the person with the cash who wants to do the development actually wants to own and manage what they're going to make. That was the, in London terms, that was the difference between the Reichman brothers who developed Canary Wharf and the Rockefeller brothers who developed Rockefeller Center, which was, Reichman brothers were Canadian. They just wanted their money and they wanted to be out of Britain. So, and that's one of the reasons Canary Wharf looks the way it does. It's an environment which is now fated to decay because it could only serve one purpose, which is globalized capitalism, in which Britain was the capital of the financial world, which it's not going to be after Brexit. So, it's, I'm sorry to give you such a long answer about this, but it is it's a great question. It's a real strategic problem about finding, how do you find a long-term investor?
Thanks, Richard. And yeah, I think lots of people who've been to Canary Wharf at the weekend, or indeed any financial centre in many of our urban environments around Wales, Scotland, England, will recognise these sort of spaces that aren't inhabited, right? They just feel totally different. They're sort of almost defunct at the weekends, let alone going on into the future. Now, a much more detailed question for you, Pablo, which is from Phil, who's asking whether actually every element of our urban environment ought to be working hard for us to create spaces for disorder and negotiation. So every step, place of shade, every place with a view. What's your sense of that from a planning perspective?
I think, one of the arguments that we have in the book is that this kind of disorder, informal practices, gatherings, they do not happen in every part of the city. So they do not happen in every kind of urban setting. There's certain urban settings that discourage this kind of disorders. It depends a lot on the context, and sometimes we can find very inert urban settings where there are informal practices happening, but they might be very marginal. So what we propose in the book is to discover and propose which are these urban settings that or how could we transform those urban settings that do not encourage disorder or informality or social interaction or tolerance towards difference, and turn them into more open systems that do tolerate it, and that encourage informality and social interaction. So in many cases, it is a matter of rearranging the existing elements. So working with the elements that the built element that are already there, and changing the position, adding new ones, and generating these disruptions, particularly when we observe that the current setting is not facilitating these kinds of disorder. So I would say that every single element, it's not about the elements themselves. It's not about each step. It's about how they relate to other elements and how they relate to human beings as well. So it's more about the relationships between different elements, but that about every single element, I think.
Great, thank you. Now we have just 3 more minutes and 8 questions, which means we're definitely not going to get to all of them. So I'm going to use my chair's privilege to pick my favourite one as the last one, which is for you, Richard. It says, in your original book, The Uses of Disorder, you argued that anarchy was a positive for a city. To what extent has that moved on? Do you still think that anarchy is useful and helpful? How might anarchist thinking help us to imagine our cities today?
What an embarrassing question. And it's embarrassing because I still believe it. I just have to say about this that when I was a kid, the dominant forms of socialism were state socialism, socialist meant top-down control. And the kind of anarchism I was thinking about was not Donald Trump's version of anarchism, but Barcelona's version of anarchism, which is that you have bottom-up actions which are not submitted to a common logic, in which you have communities of people who go on strike, for instance, even though their union might tell them, oh no, you can't strike. So I'm embarrassed to say this, but I haven't learned anything in 50 years. I still believe in the idea of anarcho-syndicalism, which was fell out of fashion in 1917 with the triumph of the Russian Revolution, but its time, I think, has never really gone away.
Fantastic. Well, I think there's many people around the country cheering and applauding, I imagine. It's such a shame we can't hear them themselves through this format. But a huge thanks, Professor Richard Sennett and Dr. Pablo Sendra, for sharing your thoughts with us this lunchtime. For those interested in hearing more, do check out their book, Designing Disorder, available from all local bookshops, face mask advised, and online distributors now. You can join us for more of these lunchtime talks. Our Nesta Talks 2 series continues by coming up, so you can visit Nesta's website, nesta.org.uk, sign up for our newsletter, which will give you a first view of what's coming up. But just to let you know, in the next few months, we've got Leslie Kern talking to us about what a feminist city could look like. We're joined with Nobel Prize winning author Reb Eleanor Johnson, talking about how to campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and what we might do as nations to create more secure futures. And Mackenzie Walk on the thinkers of the 21st century. We're adding more to this series as we go, and we strongly encourage you to join us at these free events. We love engaging and interacting with people. Thank you all for your participation this lunchtime, for asking such stimulating questions and for joining us. And Richard and Pablo, thank you particularly for giving up your time and for really evoking a provocative conversation about the future of our cities, how we design for disruption and how we give agency and power to local people. Thank you.
Thank you.